Please welcome Luke Miller.
Hello everyone. Hello. All right, well, welcome. This is my talk on making, releasing and selling an indie game made in Python. Thank you to PyCon Australia for having me, and it's been a really great conference, and it's an honor to be doing this. I haven't done it before, so we'll see how it goes. I'm Dodgyville on all the important websites on the internet, like GeoCities and LiveJournal and Slashdot, so you can look me up. Today I'm going to be talking about design aims for an indie game, specifically my game design aims. I'm going to use my engine PyVita to just show you how to make a really quick point-and-click adventure game. There's a lot to get through. Releasing the game and publicizing it a little bit. I'll introduce my game, which is my Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant, a fun gay science fiction adventure game. It's a 2D point-and-click adventure a la LucasArts and Telltale games, so it's sort of in the same genre as Day of the Tentacle and Space Quest, Sam & Max and Back to the Future, although Back to the Future is 3D. It's a science fiction adventure, and so its inspirations were Star Trek Next Generation, Doctor Who and Space 1999, and if anyone's heard of that show, kudos to you. It's gay themed, if you haven't figured that out already. And it's sort of it sits in that same genre as Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and it's Australian gay culture, and that actually has caused a bit of trouble overseas, where people have sort of gone, it's so camp, but Australia is actually very camp. So it was released in December 2012. These are screenshots to give you an idea of what it's like. As a digital download, you play as Captain Tycho Minogue. I did say it was camp. He's brought out of retirement to face an invasion fleet led by his ex-boyfriend. And so that's the game in a nutshell, really. It's non-pornographic. I don't say that on any of the material, because straight games don't have to state up front whether they're pornographic or not, but is the most common question I get is it pornographic? It's a serious attempt at a commercial game, and it's paying the rent, which is quite rare for an indie game. So that was the who, what, where, and when. The why I made it was that growing up there was a lack of same-sex love interests in the science fiction that I loved. I think the closest I got was in the later Foundation books by Isaac Asimov, where the main character goes down to that icy planet and there's a mare, and Asimov really pains to state how manly this mare is, even though she's a woman. And that's all I really had growing up. And why I made a point and click is because a gay theme implies a gay story, so you want a genre that can tell a story. So, an RTS or an FPS aren't really conducive to telling a story, whereas the point and click is. It's also really great for casual gamers. In my mind, I thought the target audience were gay men who maybe once every 5 years would play a game, like when a Civilization came out or a Zelda. And point and clicks are really great for that because they're not time-based, they're event-based. And I picked a Disney-style graphics because, once again, a lot of people are afraid of computer games, they're afraid of gay things, so there's a lot of hurdles to overcome. So I thought by making it as non-threatening as possible, it would lend itself to comedy, but it would also try and maximize the audience for it a bit. But before we go any further and break it down into its components, I do want to sort of say that, in my opinion, indie game design, it's a craft, and you want all the components working together all the time. So you want the artistic side, you want the technical side, and you want the business side to always be working, meshed together the entire time. And you can't just do the art and have great art and then go, well, now I'll make a game for it. Or you can't just make a game and then go, now it's time to sell it. You have to, at every step in the process, ask yourself, is this artistic? Is this, technically competent? And is this marketable, sellable? Is it interesting? And are people going to want it? And so you've got to bake that in. And I'm going to keep coming back to that. So there is a bit of Python coding later on, but I've deliberately tried to keep that really short because I kind of want to get across the idea that making an indie game, it's only a very small part about coding. It's a lot more about the whole pipeline. So what should indie game developers aim for? When I first did this slide, I had fun, but one thing indie developers need to do is think outside the box and as big as possible. And so not every game needs to be fun. Like a horror game doesn't have to be fun. A sad game doesn't have to be fun. But they all need to be entertaining. And so your game just needs to be entertaining. And that's actually harder than you think. So when you make a game, one way to make it entertaining is to focus on the gameplay. And when you make games, after a while, you kind of begin to feel that there's a bit of a beat to them with the gameplay. And a lot of games, you'll notice, they actually have dead points. And a lot can be happening on the screen, like fireworks can be happening on the screen, and coins can be spinning, and things can be jumping, but actually you can be dead inside while you're playing it. And that's what you've got to learn to detect with your own games, is how to actually, you've got to feel when they're entertaining and when they're not entertaining. And that's just, I guess, something that comes with a bit of practice, because you won't always get it right. And your game will have great high points, but it'll also have low points. And hopefully you'll catch them early, because they get harder and harder to remove later on. In My Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant, the reason I know this is because I learned the hard way, because there is a dead spot in My Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant about half an hour in, where you've got to walk back and forth between a castle and a field, and you've got to do it like 3 times. And every single tester that I watch when they get to it, it's just death to them. And you minimize as much as you can, but you've really got to kind of focus on entertaining thing. Rewards is a really great way to entertain people. If you kill a swamp rat, you give them 5 gold coins. If they kill the queen of the spiders, you've got to give them 5,000 gold coins. So reward for effort is quite important. And that also helps your plotting too, because the bigger reward kind of inspires you to think bigger too. So it's not just about rats, it's about the giant spiders as well. And controls. A great example from My Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant is one of the testers came back to me and he goes, I really hate clicking on the inventory button. When you click on the inventory button, up pops all the stuff you're carrying. And keeping in mind the artistic stuff, I had animated it so it all swipes out and then swipes in, and I thought it looked really great. But it took about 1.5 seconds for it to finish. And just when you're playing a game, the menu speed has such a massive effect on gameplay, and it was just something I'd never even considered. And so I just replaced all that beautiful animation with it just pops on and pops off, and instantly the game is, twice as fun to play. The second thing I think indie developers need to really focus on is quality. The game must be polished, because you're selling it, you're asking people for money, you don't want to scam them, and also it's a personal reflection on your own professionalism in a way. So the way you get quality is bug-free. That's an obvious one, easier said than done. It needs to be complete, so you don't get 3/4 of the way through and then you just have dead ends. You want the menus to be nice. It's so easy to overlook this polish, but it's the difference between a toy game or an amateur game and a professional game. And it needs to be good looking. And I know in the open source community, we've always struggled with the artistic side or the aesthetic side of it, but it's just, don't bother showing up to the party if you're not going to work on making it good looking. Third thing that I think people should focus on is the game interesting? And that ties into the marketing publicity side of it, which we often think of as dirty words, but they're just tools for putting the game in front of people who will find it interesting. And it's only really a dirty process when you're using marketing to put it in front of people who actually wouldn't be interested in it. So you've kind of scammed them into donating their time. So you actually want to make something interesting. And that makes everything a lot easier, because people will find it and come to you. And there's a slight difference between making something that they will want versus something they want. For example, a lot of people want zombie games. So if you made an Australian zombie game, all the people in Australia would want that over a generic zombie game. So even though they say they want a zombie game, you can take that little extra level and make them something they will want. Whether that's a large enough market to pay the rent is, the business decision you have to make. Moving on. So applying the dog food test to My Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant. Is it entertaining? Is it quality? Is it interesting? Well, I spoke earlier about the dead spot in the entertaining stuff, so that was a learning process for me, but there's ways you can do it. The genre choice often lends itself to entertaining. RTS is quite action-packed. Point and clicks can often be quite slow because they're event-driven. When people get stuck, they just sit around doing nothing, and that is not much fun. Making it a comedy helps with the entertainingness. And there's a tip system in the game so that when people do get stuck, they can get out of it a lot easier. Which is, if you think having your spawn location camped by a sniper is painful, point-and-click adventure games can be way more worse than that, because frustration is the complete opposite of entertaining. Is My Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant quality? I do believe it is a complete package with a few rough edges. And was it interesting? Well, I feel like it was compelling for gay men, who were the target audience. I've got a little slide on that later. And it was also compelling for the press. So I did try and practice what I preached. So let's make a game using my engine PyVita, just a little quick one. The first step is you write your game. So in this case, Tycho, the main character, just enters a room, there's a guard, you crack open the dome, so there's been war water, he'll leave his guard, you go into the room, destroy the machine. Is it entertaining? Is it quality? Is it interesting? I said bake it in at every level, so already you should be asking yourself, are these ideas interesting? Are they visually interesting? Can I sell it? For this demo, I guess we'll have to make do. Yeah, so the basics of PyVita, the engine, is simplicity, it's feedback, and it runs anywhere. So I tried to bring a stage play mentality to it, where rather than focusing on the code, it's more about this sort of top-level design. So I always think, why doesn't Jane Campion make games? And PyVita is a little bit thinking along those lines, that she's entered a room, and she goes, I want to make Oscar and Lucinda the game. And the developers go, all right, first we've got to do is load your background.png file. You know, she just walks straight out of the room. But if you talk about it in terms of scenes and actors and items and portals, I think creative people, you know, from that area will respond to that. And that also overlaps with a sort of a test-driven mentality. One thing that PyVita tries to do is test-driven. So in fact, my Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant was done using test-driven development. And that overlaps with that play, because you write a play and then you act it. And with your test, you write your test first and then you fill in the code. And basically, an entire adventure game can be made using sort of 7 interactions: the look at, the interact with, the use item on item, actors saying thing, actors moving, and actors doing stuff. So the very basic code for a PyVita game is that, but it just gives you a blank screen, so it's not very interesting. But if we expand it a bit, we import like our scene and our actors and our actions. We've got our game script, so if you click on a leak, the Tycho will say hello world. If you click on the guard, he'll say halt. And then you've got to put together your scenes and your actors and your actions. So there's a bit of scaffolding here. You create your game object, you create a scene, you create an actor, a guard, you load up an idle action for him, add him to the game, etc., etc. But you know, I look at this code and I roll my eyes a bit, but we'll run it. Doom -de -doom. Game 2. It's built on Pygame, by the way. Yep, so here we go. As you can see, it's loaded in the scene, it's loaded in a couple of actors. There's the main guy from the game, and here's the leak. You can see PyVita's already done a bit of magic where it's gone. That action we loaded was a series of images, not just one, so it's animating it for us. But you can't do anything because there's only the 3 idle actions. So we'll quit that. Now, in much the same way that Python uses whitespace to enforce a layout, PyVita kind of uses the same thing in the directory structure. If you've got data actors, data fonts, all that sort of stuff. If you're willing to use that enforced layout, and you don't have to, but it's worth it, you can replace all the scaffolding with this game.smart, which will pull it all in and just make it available. So if we look at our next updated version of that script, we import the same stuff. We've got our game scripts. We've expanded this one a bit so that when you click on the leak, it cracks, it gets bigger, the guard walks over to it, then the door gets opened. That load state I'll explain later. You update the interact scripts, and that sort of stuff. And that whole scaffolding about loading an actor and everything has been replaced by this smart load. So this script does infinitely more stuff than the first one, but it's the same length. So if we run that, we get a splash screen now, for example. So here we have, we click on the leak, cracks, gets bigger. It's unfortunate, cheerio, he walks over, and now he's stuck. And so now we can walk around. And because there are multiple actions for his walk cycle, the A-star search stuff kicks in, and he actually can walk around. And we added an exit button as an example of the menu. So there you go, that's all it takes to basically make an adventure game using PyVita. It's pretty easy. Right. So I mentioned the test-driven development stuff earlier. It's a really useful idea. If we look at the code a bit further, we've got this bit where we've taken our story and we've broken it down into a step-by-step. So we've gone, you know, the location is the foyer, you interact with the guard, you interact with the leak, and that's when it gets bigger. Then the guard will walk over, all that sort of stuff. And there's the second part, which we haven't seen, which hasn't been done yet, where you go into the dome, interact with the machine, you know, the machine explodes. So when we run the test runner for that, we get, it all runs perfectly fine until we find out we don't have a scene called dome. And so this way you can always, you've converted your play into tests and you'll always know when your game stops working. So it's quite good. And the other, and something that I got through development is that that test suite is very similar to a walkthrough, which is very similar to a help system. So you can always tell where someone is in the game by whether they've tripped the next item in the walkthrough list, and also very similar to how you can save your files. So what you can do is you can auto-generate a walkthrough for the game using the same test suite. And for point-and-click adventure games, that's very important. But there is one mea culpa with that, and I actually didn't find this out until just before release, is that it only tests a perfect playthrough. So you can guarantee that the game, when those tests all complete, you can guarantee that someone can play through to the end of the game if they play it perfectly. But if they at any point deviate from the walkthrough or the test suite, they can break the game. And that has been the main cause of problems. So the preferred PyVita walkthrough is you write your game, you break it down to a step-by-step directions, then you build the sets, like hire artists to do the artwork, you get your actors, and then only then do you write your game scripts. I will just quickly load that back up. One of the things I should mention about the game engine, is that there's an in-game editor. So, because I'm trying to close that feedback loop where you always show the artists exactly what they're doing. Anyway, back to the thing. Something that I think is very important in games, is often overlooked, and is also a sign of quality, is accessibility. And I really believe that people don't have accessibility issues, software has the accessibility issue. So there's a really great website called the Game Accessibility Guidelines, and they can give you maybe 36 ways to improve not just your game, but also your websites. And it can be simple stuff like making sure there are subtitles, all the way up to making sure you can remove timing events for people who have problems dealing with timing issues. Yeah. One of the reasons why I've kept that code section so short is because I really want to impart the idea that making a game from start to finish, the code is actually a very, very minor part of it. If we look at the stack that I used, it was Google Docs, Pygame, GitHub is the repo. If you're not using a remote repository, the peace of mind it brings you is really quite substantial. Trello is quite good for liaising with artists and everything. It's a management system, whether you've got cards and you shift them around. Then the game scripts, such a small part. Packaging, I used Py2exe. I'll have a slide on that actually. AWS is for the website, and the online store is Bitmicro. So packaging. This is something where Python actually, by design, isn't so great at. Packaging up a binary to sell on platforms like Windows, but there are ways around it. There's game2exe.py for compiling a static exe, and then you package it up with Interset. On Mac, there's Py2app and create-dmg, which creates those distributable images. And then for the Linux install, because I actually distribute the source code with the game, I've got no problem with that. The Linux install is just the source and a little install script that downloads Pygame, because that's a bit like what Steam does. Because I thought, is it legitimate to have an install script that installs Pygame system-wide? But if Steam does it, then I've got no problem doing it. And I've got it down to 1 config file and 3 build scripts. So it's not too bad. But you don't want to do it too often, especially when you start putting it up on other stores and your other builds. One thing that I think a lot of people forget is when you ship a game, have a way of updating it, or at least informing people that there's an update available. Auto update would be ideal, but you'll never, but if you don't get to it, just check for an update and give them a little message, which is what we do. And in brackets, and this is sort of a double meaning to this, you'll never launch 100% perfect. Well, you won't. No. So another part of game development that's mega important is your website. People often think of it as an afterthought, but when you first think of your game, you should already be thinking about the website. It's your game's values in miniature. So if you've made a fun game, you want a fun website. If you've got a hardcore game, whatever that might be, you want a hardcore website. Start small. You don't have to have it community forums and everything. For an earlier attempt at a game, I had a whole dynamic website that I wrote in Django and everything. But for this one, I actually just went a static website. It's worked out perfectly fine. And apply the same values to your website. So you probably want to go sell it as a digital download. There are many ways to do it. There's digital stores, and then there's sort of app stores for PC, like Steam and that. The two main digital stores, I'd say, are BMT Micro and Indie Store. I think Indie Store integrates better with your website because it can be just a single box on the page, whereas BMT Micro takes you to a sale page. But for whatever reason, Indie Store didn't want my Ex-Boyfriend the Space Tyrant. So we're on BitMicro. They're pretty good. They respond really well. Fast turnaround times, etc., etc. If you're making a PC game, it's worth thinking about getting it in indie bundles, which is where you team up with some other developers. And once a year, there's a sort of a big sale, or well, it goes on sale as a bundle and people pay what they want. And it's quite profitable for the people involved. The three main app stores for PC games are probably Tzura, Good Old Games, and Steam. But to be honest, the only one that matters is Steam. Steam's probably about 90% of people's sales, from what I hear. I'm not on Steam. And the other thing to remember about indie games is they have a very long tail. So with blockbuster games and things like films, you often think if it's not a hit on the first day or the first weekend, it's failed. But with an indie game, it does take a lot longer to percolate, I guess, through the internet. For example, I was released in December 2012, but June was the game's best month. So there's hope for everyone. And once you release it, there's a thing called the death of the author, where you've got no control over how people actually receive your game. I mean, you can do your best to make an entertaining game, but if someone's had a bad morning when they sit down to review it, they'll probably give you a bad review. So you've just got to kind of let go a bit once it's gone and not try and take any of the criticism personally. Especially when you're dealing with the whole world, just people coming at it with completely different cultural expectations, things that you think are completely fine, people take issue with, that sort of stuff. Some of the issues you'll be facing are feedback from people, journalists, sending out review copies. It's always good to have review copies ready to send out. Some reviews will be good, some will be bad. Quote the good ones and just ignore the bad ones. Hero swag, it's actually a really good opportunity when you make a game, is contact people you've admired and just send them a copy of your game. And they often always reply, and so you got a little email from them saying, from a hero going, well, thanks for a copy of your game. One thing that happened to me just on my way here, basically, on Friday, was a fellow on YouTube who started playing the game for his followers, and he got like 40,000 views while I was on the plane. And just, he's come at it as, look at this oddity, so he's not playing it seriously, because he's not gay or anything. And so it really does your head in a bit, just to see, because you kind of want to grab them by the shoulders and say, you know, for God's sakes, that's not how it's meant to be played. But that's how they're playing it. And you kind of go, well, there is no right way to play it. Community politics, I mean, I did put it up on Steam Greenlight. I waited as long as possible because Greenlight is this process where everyone on Steam gets to vote yes or no. And so it's this ultimate democracy kind of thing, whereas a gay game will only ever appeal to 5% of the population, unless it's crossover. So I knew it wouldn't fare very well on Steam, but the economics of it are too big to ignore in a way. So I did put it on, and one of the things that surprised me about it is that, and also on things like Reddit, is that people start talking about issues the community's facing using your game as a proxy. So the most common, one of the most common criticisms on Steam is that your game looks like a Flash game, because there's this whole debate on Steam about why it's better than Neweggs and things like that. And you just sort of blithely waltz into these really nuanced debates, and if you're not careful, you can you know, really get a whack around the head. A really great thing is to go for neglected media. One of the things with the accessibility stuff is that there are a lot of blogs and news websites devoted to disabled gaming and things like that that are completely ignored. So if you make a game that is got some special accessibility features, it's a great way to sort of circumvent the gaming press and get in sort of sideways. And also, I can't state the importance of third-party advocacy. If you get people you don't know talking about the game and writing nice things about it, your job will be so much easier. How much time do I have, sorry? Not too bad. Well, so here's some of the positive feedback, basically. It's a bit long. The bottom one is kind of indicative of it all. Like, I swear this is a real comment, but to me it sounds like just something you'd make up yourself. It's a whole lot of fun. As a gay guy, this is a game I've been waiting to play all my whole life. Thanks, Brian. But there is a lot of negative feedback. Yes, I like them spelling a vomit. Yes, it is what it is. So one of the things about the press that the press that I learned is that so I structured the game to have a couple of stories to tell. I thought there'd be an Australian story to tell to the Australian press. I thought there'd be a gay story to tell to the gay press. I thought there'd be an indie story to tell to the indie press, even though there's a lot of indie games. What I found was that basically, okay, I'll jump to that. Only gamers are interested in games. Getting non-gamers to talk about your game is almost impossible. They're just petrified of games. So I misjudged that a bit by thinking, oh, it's for gay men who don't really play games. You've really got to make a game for gamers, or else there's no point really. Two other lessons that I learned the hard way was that my game's $22, and it's worth that, but that's not where the market is. So, and you know, ultimately, it's worth what the market will pay. And I would say if you're making an indie game, try to get $10 or below for your price. So when you're thinking of the effort you put into that, aim for that price point. And the other thing that I think is really important is that great ideas become good ideas, become boring ideas over the process of making a game. So when you start, you think this is a great idea for a game, everyone's going to love this, and then you get some really great art, and then that idea all of a sudden is like, you know, the art's kind of better than the idea, or the art's better than the gameplay. So then you improve the gameplay, and you're like, all of a sudden, now this art looks kind of crap. And so it's just kind of this process. So start off trying to make the greatest game you've ever seen. Small game, but the greatest one ever, because at the end of the pipeline, it won't be the greatest game ever made. So in the future, I'm making a second game. I'm doing a new version of PyVita. And so I hope this presentation is giving you some ideas on taking your own game idea from dream to reality. Thanks for listening.
PyCon AU would like to thank Luke for giving this talk with a wonderful coffee cup and some Norwegian blue coffee.
Thank you.
Join us in thanking him again.
And the mug. Awesome. Thank you.